Good afternoon or good morning for our US friends. Welcome everyone to the Young Scholars virtual meeting on NATO's role in arms control and non-proliferation, lessons from the past, current challenges and future perspective. This event is jointly organized by Istituto Affari Internazionali, International Affairs Institute, Rome, and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. It's the first of a two-day marathon. Tomorrow we will have a public conference on the same topic with an enlarged audience. Today we are only 70 people selected among young scholars and students who applied to join this conversation. The conversation is the result of a one-year-long project. We wanted to have this meeting in person, but unfortunately it's not been possible because of the pandemic. So we turned to online meeting, but we hope to have a similar level of interaction and interest despite we don't meet in person. And you know, having 70 people registered is already a good starting point. Today we are going to have first 3 welcome remarks by distinguished stakeholders, and then the presentation by the 4 paper givers. So without further ado, I give the floor to Natalie Tocci, Director of International Affairs Institute, Rome, for her welcome remarks. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks, Alessandro, and a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Institute for International Affairs for this Young Scholars virtual meeting, as Alessandro was highlighting, really aimed at engaging students and scholars really on the broader themes of non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, and in particular focusing on the contribution and the role that NATO can play in all of this. And of course, the reason why we think that this is well, not only a highly important subject, but a subject on which in particular youth needs to engage itself more, is really due to the fact that on the one hand, these are, of course, vital, I mean, literally vital questions, questions on which, unfortunately, there is still certainly not enough knowledge, considering just how vital they are. And in particular, we feel that it's especially important that young people, students, engage themselves more directly on these questions, considering how vital they are for our security, and in fact, their security, in particular, the security also of younger generations. I'm particularly thrilled that this particular initiative really did solicit quite meaningful interest and engagement. We received over 60 applications for this meeting. It was a pretty tough selection that we had to make, and so I really would like to sort of congratulate all of you present here that obviously managed to make it into the selection. I think today is a particularly interesting opportunity, really, because it gives the opportunity to all of you here present in this meeting to engage in, well, to listen and then engage in a discussion with really 4 fantastic speakers. So you'll have the opportunity to listen from Rose Guttenmüller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Wilfred Wam from the UNIDIR, from Katerina Kubiak from the European Leadership Network, and Professor Leopoldo Nuti from the University of Roma Tre. And it's really, I think, a particularly important moment to discuss these questions, not only because, as I said, these are vitally important questions for international security, but also because we are going through a vitally important moment, an opportunity for NATO itself. And so it's the nexus between the importance of arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament on the one hand, and the contribution that NATO can make at a time in which we have a new US administration, which has really placed on top of its foreign policy list the reassertion, the revamping of partnerships and alliances, of course, beginning with NATO. So on the one hand, in a sense, we have a sort of incredible opportunity that NATO is going through. And on the other hand, from questions related to sort of reviving the Iran nuclear deal, so questions concerning arms control, if we think about the steps that obviously will need to be made and are already being made, if we think about the extension of START 2, in terms of arms control. So we have, on the one hand, the challenge, but also the opportunity that NATO in particular presents, as it also, I think, as I was hinting at, is now living through a moment of sort of re-strengthening, revamping, and also reconsidering ultimately what, and I guess this will come later along in the sense the line, but also reconsidering what its broader strategic concept is. So having said all this, simply to highlight the importance, I think, of the moment, I think that this will be a particularly interesting opportunity to all of you, but I think also for us as well, to listen from you as young people, what you consider to be the most pressing challenges as well as opportunity facing this nexus between NATO and questions concerning arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament. So anyway, I probably already spoke far too long, simply to say a very warm welcome to all of me, and I hope and I'm pretty sure that you'll have a wonderful couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for your comment. Let me complement what you said by underlining that this webinar came at the end of a 1-year-long project which EI have been working on, and particularly from the non-proliferation side, Ettore Greco and Federica Dall'Arche, and from the defense side, Carolina Muti and Ottavia Credi. And if you look their CV, you see that we are already well balanced in terms of age, seniority, and gender. Having said that, let me give the floor, and I'm very pleased to give the floor to Ministro Plenipotenziario Luca Franchetti Pardo, Vice Director General for the Political and Security Affairs, Central Director for Security from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Minister Pardo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your presence today.
Grazie. Thank you very much. Good afternoon for those on this side of the ocean, and good morning for those on the other side. It's really a pleasure for me to open this seminar. As Natalie said, and you said also, it's a very interesting time. It was supposed to be scheduled a few months ago, but maybe it's even more interesting to have it now, precisely because of some changes and evolutions to which Natalie referred in the outset, and I'm sure we'll come back also in what our lecturers will have to say in these 2 days of works. It's even a challenging time for arms control and non-proliferation, and I'm glad that so many young scholars and students are now focusing on an issue which sometimes may seem only for experts, but on the contrary, something which is very relevant to our own security and the security of our populations. On the outset, let me first acknowledging that indeed the world is facing a new and unprecedented test, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, which have indeed a far-reaching wild cards that are challenging the multilateral system like never before. On the top of that, on the global scenario currently standing in front of us is deeply concerning, with heightening international and regional tensions, which precisely this pandemic has somehow also contributed to increase. So we really need time and the same determination to safeguard and to strengthen the architecture on disarmament, arms control and non-proliferation in order to preserve the results achieved so far and to prevent a new arms race in this domain. Unfortunately, in recent years, the crisis of multilateralism, which we alluded to, the increased polarization in the international scenario, and the deterioration of overall security framework have contributed to the progressive erosion of the disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation architecture. Key pillars of the international arms control have been lost or weakened. It is worth mentioning, among others, the demise of the 1987 Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate Range and Shorter Range Missiles, INF, the US withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018, and the US withdrawal on the 2002 Treaty on Open Skies, and the recent announcement of Russia that it could follow it. As new complex challenges ahead, namely the risk of nuclear proliferation cases, the unacceptable use of chemical weapons, and the need to improve biosecurity and biosafety, the need for more effective engagement in this field is more urgent than ever. But allow me also to close on in this aspect on a more positive note, because we are really very pleased that the first bold move by the US administration, as I think also Natalie alluded to, is to reach a deal with Russia to extend the START Treaty, which is a key instrument in the current arms control regime for a 5-year period. This will give us time to work on also on other strengths. In this regard, NATO has for many years actively contributed to effective and verifiable arms control and disarmament efforts, and continues to play a critical role in the near future. And let me recall the North Atlantic Statement on the 50th anniversary of TNP, and indeed NATO has been involved in a variety of ways. In conventions arms control, the Alliance has taken a direct coordinating role in both negotiations and implementation. In other instances regarding disarmament and non-proliferation, NATO has contributed to raising international awareness by serving as a forum for consultations and exchange of information. This draws me to emphasize Italy's commitment to disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation as essential components of our foreign policy. As I have said before, multilateralism and international cooperations are crucial to effective and long-term result in this field. This is why Italy has been long time active on various international fora that include NATO, UN, European Union, as well in the context of major international conventions, and will continue to be actively engaged in all relevant fora. As we share with the rest of the international community a strategic interest in protecting disarmament and arms control, we are committed to promoting international adherence and full implementation of nuclear, biological, and chemical non-proliferation regimes. We also welcome all arms control regimes as they provide transparency and contribute to regional and global stability. As I said, this is really one of the key pillars of our foreign policy when it comes to security. And therefore, I already mentioned the strategic extension, but further reductions in nuclear arsenals and their eventual elimination require our cooperation in addressing the security and humanitarian dimensions of nuclear weapons. Our commitment for a safer world for future generations underpin our efforts for effective progress in nuclear disarmament. Across all these issues, there is now a perception that new weapon technologies and concepts are posing a variety of distinct and interconnecting challenges. Indeed, while so far game-changing weapon technologies seem to emerge only once per generation, the pace of technological change shows no sign of slowing today. On the contrary, it is sort of incremental pace. Thus, now more than ever, it is vitally important that we all work to empower the next generation to be actively involved in these fields, as we need a collective, renewed commitment towards preserving disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation architecture. Greater interaction with civil society, broadly encompassing academia, NGOs, and private sector, could make a key contribution in this field. In this respect, allow me to recall the enormous ethical issues connected to the development of lethal autonomous weapons. This is not the place to do it, but as I turn to young generation, this is an aspect which I think is very crucial to bear in mind. As the world faces a range of potential destabilizing challenges in the coming decades, the international strategic context underscores the need for a more effective arms control. The link between peace and security and arms control architecture is undisputed. And in this scenario, NATO indeed is called to play a specific role, and I can assure that Italy intends to play fully its role within NATO. So I think that I've spoken already too much. So what I want to do really is to raise awareness among young generation. I think this is the right place to do it, the right way to do it. And therefore, I thank all the participants for being with us, and I hope all the best to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much for your kind words. And now, last but not least in these welcome remarks, Dr. Nicola De Santis, Head of Engagement Section, Public Diplomacy Division, NATO Brussels. Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Institute of International Affairs, EI, with NATO as a long-standing cooperation, and I myself go back to many years. I wouldn't even want to count them because they go back almost 3 decades with Stefano Silvestri, Gianni Bonvicini were the directors, and of course with the new generation that today invited me to be here. And why am I here? Because we were supposed to do this event actually before the pandemic started. We wanted to reach out to young experts and also have a debate on an issue which is very important, as all those before me and after me have underlined and will underline. And let me tell you that, for us, looking at the younger generation is really a priority. If you look at the different events that we've been organizing during past months, also the Secretary General, you would see a very focus on the younger and the successor generation. COVID-19 has prevented us from doing this event in person, but has not prevented us from using new technologies. And also now in the Public Diplomacy Division have discovered how online events also have the possibility to continue to be engaged with civil society and continue debate. But we have been able, of course, at NATO, challenged by COVID-19, to continue our work, which is to protect our member countries, to continue to defend the member countries, but also to continue on deterrence, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, their delivery means, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which destabilizes also states, is very high on our agenda. But with COVID-19, we've also helped a lot of people. I would say COVID-19 has also shown the globalization of solidarity. NATO has helped the reinforce civilian efforts. Hundreds of hospitals have helped, cure people. Hundreds of flights of NATO led have also been able to deliver not only critical medical supplies, but also deliver and bring people to hospitals so that they could be cured. But let me also say that COVID-19, which is something that we're still trying to cope with, and we will have to cope still for some time, has not made the security challenges and threats affecting the transatlantic community go away. We have seen again, alongside the issues linked to proliferation, the continued spillover from conflicts, from failed and failing states, the spread of international terrorism, the instabilities that also come and insecurities from the return to global power competition. Russia, which we had defined as a partner in our current strategic concept. Russia with in 1997, we did the Founding Act, and in Rome in 2020, we developed and strengthened our partnership. Today, Russia has set backward, I would say, the clock of history. Now we have seen this with the illegal annexation of the challenges following the illegal annexation of Crimea, eastern Ukraine. We have seen Russia launching disinformation campaigns. We've seen cyber attacks. We've seen Russia interfering also with elections in our member states. And when we look at the INF Treaty, unfortunately, Russia, which was a partner in this one too, has been responsible for its demise. And this also forces us to look at arms control in different ways, and this is what you will be debating, starting with the next panel. But let me also look at the fact that China is now a new actor that we have to look at. China, which is becoming the first global economic power, China, which has the second defense budget, China, which is now in the world, China, which is modernizing its missile systems and the range of them, if we still have to apply them to the INF categories, would be illegal right now. But hypersonic gliders, the artificial intelligence, Luca was talking before of the challenges that not only automated but autonomous systems of artificial intelligence pose to us. And so we are looking now at NATO, also at China. We want to understand what are the implications of this alongside the other security challenges and threats, from proliferation to terrorism, through the instabilities coming from failing and failed states that I described before. And that's why the Secretary General of NATO has launched the NATO 2030. Ettore Greco asked me to elaborate a little bit on this. NATO 2030 is really looking at the future. The Secretary General has started its own reflection for a future-oriented NATO, basically in three areas: making the first one, NATO stronger militarily. If you look at Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, since 1949, asks member countries to contribute and to update the capacity of their defense systems for the protection of our member countries. And of course, this is particularly relevant today. So stronger militarily means developing those capabilities which will allow us to deal with new security challenges and threats. NATO capability is its credibility, especially for deterrence and defense. Second, strengthen the political dimension of NATO. Stay stronger politically means that political consultations among the members with a way to discuss issues affecting each other's securities, also those issues where we have divergent views, but always trying to find a way in which consensus can be built with the alliance, is a key component of our work. And of course, these in a moment in which, as also at the beginning, Natalie mentioned, there's a new administration, the strengthening transatlantic dimension, the dimension of the transatlantic bond is fundamental for NATO. And of course, NATO on a political level is the only agency which brings together Europe and North America. And this, the strength of our democracy, is the best way to deal with future challenges. And also, the third, I would say, objective of NATO 2030, it's to look at partnerships, develop a global approach, look at global partners, not because NATO wants to be a global organization, but because the challenges and threats are globalized, so a security organization has to deal with them. And this means working with partners who are like-minded in terms of values. NATO is a community of interest, but it's also a community of interest: democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law. So partners which are countries with we can share these values which underpin the alliance, which actually are the values of the preamble to the Washington Treaty, but also international organizations, partnerships with the United Nations and with the European Union. And in NATO 2030, the Secretary General, since the beginning, has started to consult also with civil society, not only the experts that were established at the London Summit, but also civil society organizations. We organized the first Youth Summit, the first hackathon most recently, so new ways also to reach out to young people. And my presence today is also important for this. The Secretary General has also said, and this is my last point today, that all this reflection, his reflection, will bring ideas on the table in 2 days to the defense ministers, shortly after to the foreign ministers, and later on this year to the summit with NATO's heads of state and government, with President Biden will be there, which will be the summit in which we will strengthen again the transatlantic relations. And the strategic concept is an important document for NATO. Let me remind that until the Cold War, this was a classified document. It was a secret document. In November 1991, at the Rome summit of NATO's heads of state and government, we made it public. We wanted to show the world how NATO was trying to build a new security order in Europe on transparency and giving the vision, sharing the vision with its public, the NATO's vision of the security environment, and how we would continue to protect our member countries. In 1999, at the Washington summit celebrating NATO's anniversary was revised. It was revised in 2010 in November at the Lisbon summit. And therefore, it is now time, in a time in which we're looking at a different security environment than the one that we had in 2010, that the allies will look at it in a way that will strengthen transatlantic relations. It will enable NATO to continue to provide for the security of its member countries, so their democratic institutions can be strengthened in an environment of security and peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for bringing a perspective from Brussels, from NATO. Very good and very interesting to hear that working is going on for the first summit with President Biden and on the new strategic concept with the view not only to the next months, but to the next decade, to 2030. Now we close the welcome remarks with Nicola De Santis, and we enter into the round table with only 5 minutes delay. So I'll keep very short my initial remarks, just to say that the papers of the speakers are online on the EI website. I'm sure you already saw them. Each speaker is going to introduce his or her paper in 5 minutes. Then we open the floor for the questions. And I really encourage participants to exploit this opportunity, because it's really rare, I must say, to have a distinguished expert, former high-level officials in a space only for you, only for the audience of young scholars and students. And I'll make the best to collect as much as questions as possible and to have an interactive debate. Each participant can make a question by using the raise hand function on their laptop. I'm sure this generation is very familiar with this kind of technology. Or participant can go on the website sle.do, and use the hashtag NATO MPT to write the question. In that case, please make sure to write name and surname. We would like to have a frank, explicit, and gentle exchange of view, looking each other in the eyes and possibly knowing he's speaking. So having said that, I will follow the alphabetic order in the agenda. So the first speaker is Rose Guttmuller, distinguished lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and Center for Security and Cooperation, Stanford University, San Francisco, and also former Assistant Secretary General at NATO. Thank you very much, Rose, for being with us at about 7 a.m. in the morning and West Coast. Rose, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and it's wonderful to be with you all here in California, where indeed it is now just beginning to get light. The street lamps are still on outside. I can see them, but I'm bringing the sun up with you in Europe, and very glad indeed to do so. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here with you today. You will note that I had a co-author on the paper, and that is Stephen Hill. Well, Stephen Hill has now himself become a senior official. He is now the senior director on the National Security Council staff in the White House, working for President Biden on issues related to legal matters, and particularly working on legal matters that affect our relationship with our allies, with Europe, and I'm very pleased that he is in that role, but you won't see him today. He's got well, in truth, today is a holiday in the United States. It's President's Day, so happy President's Day to all of you, but I do think they're probably working in the White House nevertheless. So we've already heard quite a bit about NATO's involvement, and it's wonderful to have Nicolas De Santis on this call this morning, my former colleague when I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. So you've heard quite a bit about NATO's role. I do want to stress a couple of points as I get into my remarks. The first is that our paper looks at what is called ADN, Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation. And NATO is equally involved in all of those things, and also equally involved, as several speakers have already noted, in not only nuclear weapons matters, but also chemical and biological, all the weapons of mass destruction, as we say. NATO has been engaged on and involved on for most of the years of its history. And I want to stress that the paper, I think, very well lays out that history and all the many contributions that NATO has made in this sphere, quite actively engaged and involved in the diplomacy over the years, particularly in the period when we began to try to work with the Soviet Union and with the Warsaw Pact countries, many of whom are now members of NATO, but in the period of the 1960s to begin to work on conventional arms control. And so NATO too has been very much involved in that area, although that is not our discussion today. We are involved and focused on much to do with the nuclear environment. But NATO has been involved across the board, and I think indeed the Secretary General has regularly opined on these matters. I'm thinking of the speech which we cite in our paper from October of 2019, when the Secretary General spoke at length about the responsibilities for NATO working in this sphere. And very important that those messages now be renewed, because again, as a number of our speakers, including Nicola DeSantis, has said, we're beginning now into a new era in the Biden administration, when there's been a lot of already thought about putting in place some new directions in nuclear arms control policy. I, for one, was very pleased that the New START treaty was extended fully for 5 years, and that happened just 2 weeks ago. So now we have the opportunity, with New START being extended, to think very seriously about what the next stages of nuclear arms control will be. And I know that President Biden and his team are very focused on sitting down with the Russian Federation and beginning some discussion of the new technologies that we have already heard something about this morning. Hypersonic glide vehicles. What are we going to do about artificial intelligence and the implications of that for command and control, for the national command systems that command and control our nuclear weapons systems, and we want to make sure that they remain under a firm system of command and control. So there are a lot of new technologies out there that some of which are already playing a major role, as we can see in many cyber attacks happening every day on our government institutions. I know NATO headquarters regularly withstands cyber attacks, and they ensure that there is a certain, as we say, gray area already in existence, where there are attacks going on in the cyber realm every single day that could have implications for each of our national securities, for each of our armed forces and how they operate. So many, many important issues to discuss in the realm of strategic stability, but we also have to think quite explicitly about the next steps on nuclear arms control. And I've been pleased that President Biden and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, as the New START treaty was being extended, said that immediately they will turn their attention with the Russian Federation to thinking about negotiating the next phase of nuclear reductions. And I think that is a very, very good message and a very, very good step. But the NATO allies will have to help this time round. And I think that that's also something very important to focus on as we go through the conference today and tomorrow as well, because we're getting to a phase, and here I like to give President Trump and his administration a good deal of credit, because they were the first ones to put on the table an overall freeze on nuclear warheads, on all nuclear warheads. This has been something that we have wanted to do for many, many years, to directly limit warheads. But we were never able to do it because they are so difficult to monitor and verify. Nuclear warheads are very, very sensitive, and the most secret facilities are where nuclear warheads are housed. And so it will be important now to think about how to carry this principle forward of directly limiting warheads. President Putin, in principle, agreed to it. I know the Russians have said now that as far as they're concerned, the offer is off the table, but I do think it's important that President Trump and his team laid down the principle and began talking about monitoring and verification of such a freeze on warheads, which if you are monitoring and verifying a unilateral freeze, you are beginning to turn it into an agreed limit. And that is what we actually need in our future arms control treaties and agreements, is monitoring and verification, so we can be assured that our partners, the Russian Federation, are actually implementing a direct limit on warheads. And the same goes for the Russians. Of course, they want to know what's happening on our side. But that means that the NATO allies will also have to be involved to look at what they may be responsible for in terms of monitoring and limiting warheads, what kind of transparency measures perhaps at facilities on NATO territory, what kind of verification measures perhaps at facilities on NATO territories. And this will be a very complex and difficult effort. But I want to underscore again what several of our speakers have said, and that is, I see NATO as ready for this. NATO has been very engaged in recent years on these issues, thinking through the complex nature of many of the questions related to arms control and disarmament, and thinking ahead about what is necessary also to continue to fight on behalf of the non-proliferation regime. And I will end my remarks by just pointing out that we have work to do in this realm as well. The review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is coming up this August. It too has been delayed by the pandemic, but it will be taking place in August. And at the same time, we now have the so-called ban treaty, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, TPNW, is in force, and it's necessary, as I see it, to ensure that the two communities have an open line of communication. Many signatories of the ban treaty are also members of the non-proliferation treaty regime. We need to ensure that there is open discourse between the communities, and that we are ensuring that the NPT, the non-proliferation treaty, is not in any way damaged by the advent of the TPNW. So these are just a few points to get our discussion started this morning. I know Alessandro wanted me to stick to 5 minutes, so I will end here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Rose. Thank you very much for the interesting point you raised. You raised also the point of cyber defense and cyber attack that perhaps is light at the margin of today's webinar, but that brings to me the idea to mention that we as EI have just published a paper in English available on our website, Cyber Defense in NATO Countries Comparing Model. So if you wish, you can check it out. And after this small advertisement, I'm really happy to turn to the next speaker, Katarina Kubiak, Senior Policy Fellow, European Leadership Network from London. Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you very much to the Institute for inviting me to author a paper and to present it at this conference. So I have been tasked initially to look at the role of NATO's nuclear strategy in promoting non-proliferation and disarmament in a post-INF environment. And I would now like to take you on a kind of journey on how my thinking evolved during this research. I basically assume that some of you may not necessarily associate NATO with disarmament and non-proliferation. So the first question to answer is, where does NATO stand on non-proliferation and disarmament? So after dwelling into the strategy, it seems, and this is again a generalization, that in terms of disarmament, NATO is committed to a comprehensive and controlled step-by-step approach, and sees it as a kind of sequential process in which the conditions and an improved security environment is necessary and required to engage into disarmament. In terms of non-proliferation, NATO is basically focusing on potential external threats to NATO's population, territories, and forces, and this includes nuclear and missile proliferation of China, Iran, and North Korea. But there are also concerns regarding vertical proliferation, like Russian INF range missiles. At the same time, NATO does not necessarily put so much attention on the proliferation activities of its own members. So knowing the direction of NATO's policy, the question is, how does NATO pursue these objectives? And basically, after looking at where NATO is present, its statements, articles speaking to people, I figured out that NATO's role is mainly consultative in nature, and it involves policy consultation and coordination among allies. But what is lacking is definitely agenda setting and implementation. So I was asking myself, why is NATO's role so limited? And what does it say about NATO's ability to shape the disarmament and non-proliferation agenda further? And I figured out that there is a couple of institutional factors that shape NATO's space for action. And I will, discuss them without without saying which one is more important. So basically, any organization or instrument are as effective as those who develop them want them to be. And NATO has a very specific modus operandi, which includes 30 states that need to come to a consensus in order for a decision to be made. And this consensus is based or limited by different preferences and interests, as well as power asymmetries among members. And allies differ among themselves on how they would prefer to use NATO as a platform or vehicle for disarmament and non-proliferation. The second issue is that member states define NATO as mainly a defense alliance, and disarmament and non-proliferation are not goals in themselves, just nice haves, but means to achieve alliance security objectives. And this basically means that this basically limits NATO to aspects that can directly affect its threat environment on one hand, and it also requires NATO to put initiatives in a broader security context. The third item is basically that NATO has no agency as an actor itself, and what comes with this is that it has no legal commitments or obligations that it has to fulfill. It's not party or a signatory to any disarmament or non-proliferation agreement. And the fourth point is that NATO as an organization does not has almost any military capability on its own that it could disarm, or institutional resources to support non-proliferation and disarmament in a tangible way, meaning, equipment, verification mechanisms, and so on. It has intangible assets like knowledge, know-how, but not necessarily tangible ones. So while it lies in the hands of the 30 members to decide, if NATO should in the future become a name on disarmament and non-proliferation, I feel there are currently two issues that we need to address. First is how NATO can harness its strengths and extend its role in non-proliferation and disarmament, and probably the new strategic concept could be a venue to explore this topic. And the second is how should NATO address the credibility challenge, which comes from its split between its disarmament commitment and its attachment to nuclear deterrence. And obviously all the papers offered good ideas on this, and this is where I would like to finish my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you for the very clear messages you sent in your speech, and just it's a good reminder that NATO is indeed an alliance of sovereign stations. So it's what member states want it to be. The next speaker in our lineup is Leopoldo Nuti, professor at University of Roma III, Rome. I attended another university, so I missed this course, but actually I attended one lecture when I came to present the stage opportunity for my institute, and I remember it was really fascinating. It was about an episode of the Cold War in the 50s. So I'm really glad to give the floor to you, Leopoldo, for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Thank you for your kind invitation, and thank you for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. You forgot to mention that I am a historian, so I'm the odd one out here. I will talk about the past. I'm not particularly good at talking about the present or the future, which is what the other panelists are very good at. So what I did in my paper, and I will try to keep within my 5 minutes limit, was to look at the interaction between NATO and the main arms control negotiations of the nuclear age. And I've divided the paper in two sections, one that looks at the Cold War period, and the other one that looks at the post-Cold War period. And the key question that I've tried to address in the paper is, can a military alliance such as NATO, which has never played a formal part either in the negotiation or in the implementation of any arms control and non-proliferation agreements, plausibly claim to have any role in the field of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation? And if it does, what can that role be? What would it be? Has NATO given a contribution to the stability of what we call the global nuclear order? And if it has, what has it been? So the answer to this rather rhetorical question is what I would call a qualified yes. Indeed, NATO has played a role. I would be tempted to say it's a problematic yes. NATO has been involved in shaping many arms control decisions, but with a rather mixed record. And I've provided a large number of historical case studies to prove my point, which I will not list here. We can go back to them in the Q&A section. We can discuss them more in detail tomorrow if you want. You can read them in the paper. So what I will do is jump at the conclusions of my paper, to provide some food for thought and for the discussion. So if you look at the interaction of NATO and the arms control and non-proliferation negotiations of the nuclear age, you can reach three different conclusions. The first is that the alliance has gone through what I call a learning curve. Has learned how to balance its own key reliance on a deterrence posture with arms control and non-proliferation. It has been a gradual process, which was initially resisted by a large number of the allies, particularly in the 1960s and even in the 1970s, when they had mixed feelings about what the United States and the Soviet Union were doing. But basically, throughout the period of detente and the late years of the Cold War, and then the early aftermath of the Cold War, NATO have learned that it's possible to combine the reliance on nuclear deterrence with the promotion of a dialogue, first with the Soviet Union and then with Russia. So the alliance learn how to the allies learn how to do this. This has never been a smooth process or an easy one. NATO is a quarrelsome bunch of quarrelsome allies, and learning how to combine these two very different aspects of its policy has been a difficult process. But, and this is my second conclusion, being a clearinghouse for these very different points of view has helped to stabilize the global nuclear order by helping to forge a consensus inside the Western Bloc. NATO has played an important role in shaping the history of the global nuclear order. Even if NATO itself has never been a formal party to an arms control treaty. By serving as a clearinghouse for the somewhat heated exchanges among the allies, NATO has helped them manage their often sharply divergent views. And some scholars have gone even further and have added that by its very existence, NATO has played a role in strengthening the non-proliferation regime by restraining the nuclear impulses of some of the Western European allies. So this particular point needs probably a couple of additional qualifications. The first is that when you talk about forging a consensus inside the alliance, you have to keep in mind that this is what we can call an asymmetrical consensus, is a consensus among non-equals, in which one member of the alliance is clearly more important than the other ones, and its role is indispensable to shape and forge this consensus. But still, even if you have to acknowledge that the United States is more equal than the others, NATO has provided the closest thing you can have to a multilateral forum to discuss and shape out a common approach to arms control and non-proliferation among allies. And the second proviso to this statement about forging consensus, to this conclusion about forging consensus, is that this consensus is fragile. And perhaps it is even more fragile now in the post-Cold War years, and particularly in the last 20 years or so, than it was during the Cold War. I know this can sound like a paradox, but the NATO has been able to combine its different aspects by mixing support for arms control and non-proliferation, by the extension of US nuclear deterrence to the Western European allies, by nuclear planning consultation inside the nuclear planning group. But this combination of different things has come under severe strains in the last 10, 15, 20 years, particularly because a number of the European members of the alliance seem to be inclined towards moving towards disarmament more than arms control. And this fragile compromise is becoming even more delicate. Third and last conclusion, in spite of everything I've just said, nuclear deterrence has remained a permanent feature of the alliance strategic identity. This is all the more remarkable if you think that throughout the 1990s, the salience of nuclear weapons in the international strategic landscape was constantly receding, particularly in the first half of that decade. And if NATO remained a nuclear alliance at the time when nuclear weapons were receding into the background, and NATO was constantly called upon to do lots of different other things, peacekeeping in the Balkans, for instance, or lots of other activities. If nuclear weapons remained crucial for the alliance strategic identity back then, they are not likely to go away anytime soon, now that we're moving towards a much more confrontational phase of the international system. So my third and final point is deterrence has remained crucial for NATO identity, and this should lead us to further reflection about how nuclear weapons have become embedded in the strategic identity of national states and of such an alliance as NATO, to the point that it has become very difficult to imagine a non-nuclear Atlantic alliance. And I will stop here, probably talked too long already.
Thank you very much, Leopoldo. Thank you very much indeed. When you say that it was not smooth during the Cold War, I remember the tale by former EI President Stefano Silvestri on how the Euromissile crisis unfolded in the early 80s in Italy and with the US and Germany. And that's a lot of substance for future history. I asked him, why you don't write an historian book on this? He replied me, too much people still alive. We have to wait. So jokes aside, I remember participants to prepare the question. They can raise the hand with the raise hand button at the end of the next speech, or for the early birds, they can write in the chat on the website sli.do. So our fourth speaker is Wilfred Van, researcher, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, Geneva. Wilfred, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandro. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be part of this panel and this project. So my paper is on the concept of nuclear risk reduction, which involves measures to reduce the risk of any use of nuclear weapons, whether intentional or inadvertent. And so my brief remarks today will provide hopefully some useful context, both on the topic and NATO's role in risk reduction. So nuclear risk reduction is not a new topic, and that's something I discuss in the paper, but it has been an area of focus the last few years, in particular because of concerns about the state of risk or the probability that nuclear weapons might get used. And these are for reasons that have been covered quite a bit already by in the welcoming remarks, as well as by my fellow panelists. Including the poor relations among nuclear armed and nuclear allied states, in particular between the West and Russia, because of the deteriorating state of nuclear arms control and disarmament, and also because of technological developments, including modernization programs among many of the nuclear armed states. Now, risk reduction can encompass quite a wide spectrum of activities, everything from political commitments to operational and technical measures. It can include activities to increase decision-making time in crisis conditions to prevent accidents, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security strategies, or lessen the range of circumstances in which nuclear weapons might be considered for use. Also, it can include things to prevent conflict in other domains, cyberspace, involving non-nuclear capabilities in which escalation could take place and involve the introduction of nuclear weapons. Of course, ensuring robust non-proliferation, negotiating arms control, and disarmament are critical parts of risk reduction, as the ultimate way to eliminate all risk of nuclear weapon use is to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. Now, in the paper, I traced what NATO has done in the past and present in the area of risk reduction. And broadly speaking, I think NATO continues to express a commitment to reduce risks. For instance, in the context of its relationship with Russia, the alliance has expressed a desire for greater predictability and transparency to avoid misunderstanding, miscalculation, and inadvertent escalation, even as it acknowledges that the difficulties presented by the current geopolitical landscape. In its recent 2030 initiative that was mentioned, the Alliance says specifically that it supports political outreach to negotiate arms control and risk reduction measures. Of course, NATO is comprised of its member states, and all of them are NPT members, and there are a number of relevant actions they have taken in that framework as well. As an example, some alliance members in the P5 are engaged on the concept of strategic risk reduction. They've created a working group. They continue to exchange on doctrines, which can be quite valuable. But I do want to state something fairly obvious, if quite important, and Katerina actually hit on this already, but the primary purpose of NATO is to safeguard the security of its members. And so how it perceives risk sources and how to address those risks is filtered through that lens. You know, increased transparency about capabilities or stockpiles, for instance, can also increase the vulnerability of those sites to attack. Reducing the role of nuclear weapons in its security can be seen by some of its members as undermining its deterrence. And I think this distinction illustrates the difficulties of practical movements, of finding consensus or political will around a concept, even like reducing the risk of nuclear weapon use, which might seem obvious at one level. And it speaks to the importance of developing common understandings and a set of priorities among all alliance members and beyond on that topic. So with that, I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilfred. Thank you very much. We already got 3 questions from the chat. So I'm going to turn this question to the speakers, and I'll follow the order I got them. So the first question is to Rose. Participants writes, we are seeing a shift in the paradigm, and rather than from multinational treaties to national policies with a greater role of national policies and to international commitment. Now it seems like a chicken egg question, who comes first, multilateral treaties, national policies, but the question mentioned also the coalition of caution wording from the US. So the question is how this will affect strategy in terms of non-proliferation and arms control. The second question is for Leopoldo, and it's a quite straightforward question. Can the NATO-Russia Council become a springboard, a launchpad for a cooperative approach on arms control with Russia, somehow compartmentalizing the issue, separating the issues from other disagreements? I understand, and well, there are two questions in one. The second twin question is what role Italy could play in this regard in the NATO-Russia Council talk on non-proliferation and arms control. And the third question is for Caterina. The participant noticed an endorsement for the treaty on the ban of nuclear weapon, and ask you what could be a roadmap to bring on board of the treaty the other NATO member states. And I'll stop here and turn first to Rose, then Leopoldo, then Caterina, and in the meanwhile I will check for other questions.
Thank you very much. As I understand the question, it has to do with the breakdown of multilateral institutions in recent years, multilateral regimes, and whether we can make up ground, or are we stuck with the consequences of this? I think this is a vital, it's really a strategic question at the moment, because there is no question that the administration of President Trump did a lot with their real emphasis on America first, I think, to turn their backs on multilateral institutions or step away from them. This was true with NATO. Certainly it was true with the European Union as well. But I would say, inattention to important international regimes, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. Of course, there were capable people working in this area, but it was not a priority for the White House. And I think the effects can be seen in a number of different multilateral regimes and relationships. So all I can say is, again, President Biden is intent, and that it was notable to me that in his inauguration address on the 20th of January, he mentioned very few things about foreign policy, but there were 2 or 3 points. And the first point was the necessity of rebuilding the relationships with the US allies and partners, and working to restore those relationships and do a lot of repair work. And I think now it is incumbent on all of us, as we are working both in and out of governments across the NATO alliance, but to ensure that we are doing everything we can to facilitate that strengthening, and the US reemphasis on this. Already at the outset of our meeting, it was mentioned that and Nicola DeSantis mentioned this, that the summit meeting is coming up, but that will be but a step along the road. The Defense Ministerial will be the first opportunity, day after tomorrow, for the new Secretary of Defense, General Austin, to come to NATO and to speak to the allies and really talk about all these issues that are of such great importance to the allies. And I know that there is a degree of skepticism out there about whether the United States is going to be true to its word, but I hope the allies will be ready to work hard and to work well in coming years to rebuild those relationships, both with NATO and with the European Union. But also then we will have to, I think, do some considerable heavy lifting to ensure the success, for example, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that I mentioned coming up in August. So this is something all of us have a responsibility to be attentive to, and to do our best to facilitate the heavy lifting that will have to be done. So back over to you, Alessandro. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose. Leopoldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That's an interesting question, but I'm afraid I'm a little bit skeptical that the NATO-Russia Council can become a useful springboard for a cooperative approach on arms control. Most progress that has ever been achieved on arms control has been done at a bilateral level, either by the United States and the Soviet Union or by the United States and Russia. And NATO has been useful in forging a consensus and has been basically part of the US toolkit to build consensus among the allies for what it achieved unilaterally. So in some cases, as if there is time, we'll talk about this tomorrow, the United States has consulted with the allies before making a final position, taking a final stance towards the Russian or the Soviet Union. But most negotiations have been bilateral ones. So I doubt that the NATO-Russia Council can play a role in this kind of extremely sensitive and delicate issues. And if that is the case, I doubt that Italy can play any role. And as a matter of fact, I think the one role that Italy could play, and I hope our diplomats here will not be too upset by what I'm about to say, but in the past, Italy has not been particularly enthusiastic about the removal of the remaining tactical nuclear weapons we have deployed in our country when other NATO members were much more gung-ho on this issue. Italy was sort of reluctant to let them go. And if this issue would ever come up again of withdrawing the 200 or so tactical nuclear warheads that NATO still has deployed across Western Europe, the only role that Italy could play would be to be a little more than lukewarm, like it was when the issue came up about 10 years ago after the initiative was promoted by the German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle in 2009.
Thank you, Leopoldo. That's an interesting point on Italy, maybe for a side talk. A couple of years ago, I would say for a coffee talk in the break. Caterina, the floor is yours for your answer.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, you know, on how to basically win NATO allies to engage with the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. So I will maybe start with my perspective that the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons will become part of the global nuclear order, the very same order that NATO wants and needs to shape. And probably dismissing it as a kind of peacenik initiative is no longer credible, especially because it reflects very practical concerns on behalf of plenty millions of people on Earth. And at the same time, especially non-nuclear weapon states being members of the alliance are in a kind of split, you know, and need to find a way to stay credible, both internationally and domestically, in the disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control policy, while still being members of NATO. So it's probably up on the international community and the domestic audiences to make a kind of pressure on non-nuclear weapon states to explore opportunities, exactly the opportunities which NATO as a forum for consultations offers to address some of these concerns. And I would definitely offer you to look at a recent commentary by ELN network member Alexander Kment, who suggested very practical ideas of what non-nuclear weapon states, members of the alliance, could do to address these concerns. And he just wrote a commentary on in January for the Toda Peace Institute, which in short basically say, you know, declare the understanding for the nuclear risks, under the current nuclear policies, declare your wish to move away from nuclear deterrence or a nuclear deterrence-based security to one which is more sustainable, acknowledging that this will not necessarily happen overnight, and substituting nuclear deterrence and moving away from nuclear deterrence set as a goal. Again, these are just some ideas. In my paper, I've suggested that because NATO consists of 3 out of 5 official nuclear weapon states, NATO allies could translate nuclear weapons-related worries of the have-nots to the haves, and encourage strategic risk reduction. And I'm strategic risk reduction and strategic nuclear risk reduction, especially.
Thank you, Caterina. Now we turn again to the floor. I got a raised hand by Riccardo Labianco. So I would ask the technician to give the floor for making the question himself. And by the way, it's good to have people wanting to let us hear the voice and see the face. So Riccardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Institute and to all the participants for this opportunity. I have a question for Wilfred one on because when I read his section on doctrinal risk, it came in my mind, because I'm a lawyer as a background, it came in my mind this question about whether you think that a pathway to reduce doctrinal risk can include also clarity on the attitude of states with regards to the international norms on the use of nuclear weapons. So, because I mean, it's a bit of a muddy water. I mean, there are different stances, and we saw them quite clearly in the advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. So I was wondering whether more clarity on IHL or jus ad bellum norms on the use of weapons might actually be another pathways to reduce doctrinal risk or even other kind of risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riccardo. The second question is from the chat and is to Leopoldo. I'm going to read it. Professor Nuti has made a reference to what William Walker calls, quote, the embeddedness of nuclear weaponry in national and international context, end quote. What are the reasons that make nuclear arsenals so hard to let go? It's a doctrinal problem, or rather the lack of an equally effective alternative? It's a good question. It's quite a nuanced question. The next question is for Rose, and is asking what is the state of the art regarding hypersonic missiles? What are the chances of actually regulating them in the medium term? And what NATO can do in this regard? Or is this just a US-Russia negotiation? And I'm really curious about this question on hypersonic missiles, because let me spoiler that in a couple of months, WSEI will publish a study in English on missile defense in Europe, which is the result of the work of myself, Carolina Muti, Federica Dell'Arche, and Ottavia Credi, and a dozen of researchers both from the Institute and abroad. End of spoiler. I turn to the last question of this round for Wilfred as well. It can be summarized like this: if Iran goes nuclear, leaving completely the constraint of the JCPOA, which could be the impact on the region and particularly on Israel. And this is a question by Georgia Cito. So we have 4 questions, 2 for Wilfred, 1 for Leopoldo, and 1 for Rose. And I will start from Wilfred.
Sure. Thank you for those quite interesting questions. Maybe on the first one about IHL, I think in terms of doctrinal risk, the most direct way to reduce risk is to address the existing nuclear doctrines of the nuclear armed states. In terms of kind of this specific aspect about clarity of all states on IHL, there's, I think, a broader conversation about whether a commitment to reduce the role or creates a taboo against nuclear weapon use can be constructive. And the discussion around the TPNW, I think, suggests that there might be negative consequences as far as engagement with nuclear weapon states. It suggests that I think there are quite difficult politics around these the normative aspects of nuclear weapons, but ultimately, I think obviously having clarity on that could be helpful in some ways. Should I jump to the last question about the Iran nuclear deal as well? This brings up quite an important point, which is nuclear risks don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're tethered to the underlying regional security dilemmas that exist. And so there have certainly been concerns that any Iranian movement towards WMD could actually propel proliferation dominoes from states, including Saudi Arabia or Egypt or so forth, and which would drive risk, you know, in a multitude of ways. And some have suggested that it might even lead Israel to reconsider its doctrine of ambiguity, or, you know, its ambiguity, its ambiguous policy towards the existence of its nuclear weapons program. In terms of risk reduction, then, I think certainly the continued promotion of existing diplomatic processes would be quite important, including discussions around the potential WMD free zone in the Middle East, which there's been some progress in some track 1.5 discussions as well. But I think you kind of start with existing processes and go from there. So
thank you, Wilfred. Thank you. Leopoldo, the floor is yours. Please unmute the microphone. Okay.
Yes, okay, thanks. Do I have a couple of hours to answer that question, or a couple of days?
A couple of minutes will be fine, thanks.
Thank you. No, I mean, that's really a question that goes to the heart of the problem, but it is what I would call an existential question, one that it's almost impossible to answer, I'm afraid, because we have been grappling with this issue almost ever since 1945, and the first time the two nuclear weapons were detonated in anger in wartime. It's a matter of status, prestige, power, security, all mixed together, that makes an intoxicating mix, so that a state that has achieved a nuclear status finds it almost impossible to let it go. And in history, we've had only a handful of cases. I mean, South Africa at the end of the Cold War was denuclearized, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were more or less persuaded to let go of the remnants of the Soviet nuclear arsenal in their territory. And to this very day, a number of Ukrainians still regret that they did. So it's really, I mean, one of the key issues of the international system we live in. And I'm afraid I don't have an exact answer other than what I just said. I mean, these are so powerful, such extraordinary powerful weapons, that whoever owns them finds it almost impossible to let them go.
Rose, your turn.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. This question of HGVs, I think, is a very good one. In truth, we have already taken, I would say, the first significant step toward regulating them, in that the Russian Federation has agreed at the highest level, President Putin himself, that their HGV, the Avangard, should be brought under the limitations of New START, and will be brought as a new kind of an existing type be brought under the limitations of New START. So that's a significant, I would say, message that HGVs can be limited in some ways by more or less traditional arms control measures, and we should look at other ways in which we can perhaps limit them going forward. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of HGVs, short-range ones. The US is saying it will deploy only conventionally armed ones, and so far has had the position that its HGV should not be limited by the New START treaty. I think that's something, frankly, that should be discussed at the arms control table. I can say that now since I'm out of government, but honestly, I do want to make the point for everyone that there have been some initial steps, and to my mind, this willingness of the Russians to have the avant-garde brought under New START limits is significant. The other point I'd like to make here, we barely talked about the other important principle that the Trump administration established, and that is that China should be willing to start coming to the table for discussions. And I truly agree with them laying down that principle, although I frankly think trying to shoehorn China into the New START treaty was the wrong way to go. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we begin thinking about with Beijing how to bring them into the discussions, because there are certain technologies in which they have some equivalence of capability. Their strategic arsenal is much smaller than that of the Russian Federation and the United States, but their other capabilities are quite significant, and their HGV capabilities are quite significant. So where they have some equality of capability and would perhaps see an interest in limiting armaments in order to ensure that the threats to their own defenses are not threatened, are not heightened, they may be more willing to come to the table. So I see that list of things where China has more capability to be HGVs, to be their space assets that they are beginning to deploy now, and also the shorter range, the intermediate range missiles, particularly their ground launched intermediate range systems. Again, we haven't talked about what should be the follow-on to the INF treaty, but I also agree that this is a new area of potentially good progress that can be made in coming years. But here there is some equality of capability on the Chinese side that we may see them developing an interest in coming to the table much more willingly than we saw during this early effort by the Trump administration. So back over to you. That's not the be all and end all, I understand. I think there will have to be other steps taken to develop some perhaps rules of the road with regard to HGVs and other normative directions for policy as well. But I did want to, for this audience, make the point and get the message out there that some initial important steps have already been taken.
It's interesting and probably it's the reflection of a new phase of the international security environment where China has a prominent role also in this field. So for the next wave of section of question, I will first ask the technician to give the floor to Emma Vicentin, who raised her hand.
Good afternoon. Thank you
Here
for
we
your
are.
amazing papers. I didn't really know a lot about NATO's role in arms control, so thank you. My question is for Rose, and it directly connects to what you just answered, basically, because it is that NATO since 2019 has been working having a working group on engaging with China, and because of course China is one of the future challenges for NATO and for arms control. And but also China has repeatedly refused to be part of any multilateral arms control. So do you think that NATO will in the future have the same role in creating consensus among allies in regards to China as it did with the US, with the Russian Federation, and before that with the USSR, for engaging China in a multilateral arms control treaty? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Emma. The next question comes from the chat. Is to Professor Nuti. Could the concept of the hegemony on the chip you mentioned in your paper be used once again in the emergence of the artificial intelligence era? And how could this affect the power asymmetries within the alliance, particularly between the US and the European states? Another question for Rose comes from Federica Giordani. It's very straightforward. Can the MTSR, the missile technology control regime, become more formalized, perhaps more powerfully announced by using NATO as a forum? Third question from the chat is from Giada Mosener, who, by the way, was my student and my degree candidate when I was professor at Perugia. So I'm very glad she's participating in the webinar. And the question for Katerina Kubiak is, now that there is more, let's say, humanitarian approach to arms control and non-proliferation, more grounded in the international law, and how can NATO deal with this approach without losing its raison d'etre as a defensive military alliance? And the last question, well, has no target, has no speaker mentioned, so I will turn to whoever wants to reply. Which nuclear risk reduction proposals can be formulated by NATO or within NATO? So to sum up, we have the first question by Emma. She spoke about that. The second question for Leopoldo about the hegemony of the chip. Third question to Rose on MTSR. Fourth question, Katerina, on humanitarian approach and NATO raison d'etre. And finally, whoever wants in his or her slot can pick up the question on nuclear risk reduction proposal. Who wants to start?
Well, perhaps I'll go first, since the first question was addressed to me, and I'll just quickly cover the MTCR question, if I may, Alessandro. I actually have been very glad, since I left NATO in October of 2019, I've been very glad to see the discussions with China have matured. There's now a regular senior level working group, just as you say, that is getting together with the Chinese, between NATO and China, to talk about political military topics. And I'm very pleased that they have included arms control on that agenda. I think that's very good. And so NATO can play a role, I think, in talking to the Chinese about important matters, such as the role or where we go from here on these measures I was talking about a moment ago, such as what will be the follow-on to the INF Treaty. And the way NATO does that, in my opinion, again, I'm not representing anybody in the US government, or I'm certainly not representing NATO anymore, but in my opinion, the best way to go about it would be to talk to the Chinese about the history of the dual track decision in the 1980s. We've already had some remarks about what a watershed that was, how difficult it was to come to a consensus inside NATO on the dual track decision to both deploy the Pershing II and Glickums in Europe, but also to engage in really intensive negotiations with the USSR at that point and move forward. And the result of that eventually was the INF Treaty. So I do think that talking about that history with the Chinese would be useful, because it can help to bring home the strategic implications of having very fast flying or very stealthy missiles that are within a very short warning time of national capitals, and the effect that that could have, again, on strategic command and control, on national command authorities, the danger potentially of a decapitating first strike that come from having intermediate range ground launch systems with so little warning time within striking distance of national capitals. So for the Chinese, this is a history I'm sure they know, but they may not realize the degree to which NATO has saw it historically as a real strategic threat, and to the degree to which NATO has been concerned about the new ground-launched missile that the Russians have deployed, the 9M729, and the dangers that it may pose to NATO capitals. So I do think that NATO has a role to play here, and to begin with, by recollecting that history, I think could be quite a useful discussion to have with Chinese counterparts. Now, on the MTCR, it's an excellent question, and I have to admit I haven't been really studying this question. I'd like to hear, frankly, the questioner's answer, because no doubt they have a view on this matter. But I would say in general, I think this is more a matter for the MTCR regime members in the context of the regime venue where they talk about these issues rather than NATO per se. I think that would be my reaction. But again, if you want to post in the chat your own view on this matter, I would be very, very interested to see what you have to say. So thank you very much. Back over to you, Alessandro.
Thank you, Rose. Leopoldo, the floor is yours. And the microphone is mute.
Yes, sorry.
Here we are.
Okay, that's an interesting question. In short, the answer is I hope not. Hegemony on the chip was the way Professor David Khalil described the Eisenhower administration adoption of massive retaliation as an attempt to retain its hegemony over the USSR by threatening massive use of nuclear weapons. In the end, it wasn't cheap, and it didn't lead to hegemony. It led to an arms race as the Soviet Union tried in all possible way to match the US superiority. So I hope it doesn't. I hope we will not have an arms race in the realm of artificial intelligence. It's one of those areas where we badly need arms control agreements, and it's one of those areas where it will be very difficult to achieve any results. I mean, the issue of new technologies was mentioned by Rose and by some other ones in her presentation. And it's one of the challenges of the current international system. How can we grapple with all these new technologies? I mean, can we extend the old arms control system to these new current developments? And it's a very, very difficult question and a very difficult issue. Would it lead to an asymmetry between inside the alliance? Probably, but I mean, it all depends on how you answer the first question. Will there be an arms race in AI? And I do hope not. I do hope we come up with some creative ways of thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leopoldo. Caterina?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Giada, for this very interesting question. Unfortunately, I, at the beginning, need to probably confess that NATO and TPNW is not necessarily the focus of my own research, and I didn't have the opportunity to make the research necessary to answer this very important questions with confidence. But I would definitely encourage those who are interested in this topic to basically explore this apparent conflict between, relying on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence on one side, and on the other, acknowledging, at least some of the arguments proposed by those supporting the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapon initiative, and kind of try to work back, to reduce this related risks. And I feel that, at least from very first thoughts, both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, being NATO members, already indirectly acknowledge these risks. For example, by saying that nuclear weapons are not a weapon of choice, acknowledging or increasingly acknowledging the necessity to question rationality as a paradigm guiding nuclear policy, but also supporting very heavily risk reduction and CSBMs in the nuclear sphere in general, which all can be a kind of indirect support for the fact that everybody acknowledges this heavy risks nuclear weapons are bringing. But I definitely encourage you to explore this truly important question.
And I jump on the opportunity of the encouragement made by Caterina to remember that AI is member of the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, together with leading think tanks at university in Europe. You can find it on our website. There is a newsletter to subscribe if you want to receive papers and alert on our events. And there is also a mentorship on next generation scholars on arms control open on our website, so please check it out. Having said that, I have lots of people on the list, so we give precedence to those brave who want to tell themselves their questions. So I kindly ask to the technician to give the floor to Angelo Frasca-Caccia, who raised his hand before.
Yeah, hi everyone. I have a question for Rose. Hi Rose, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So first of all, I would just want to say congratulations on your paper. It's really excellent. My question is on SNNW, non-strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. I think that these weapons are probably more important now than they have ever been. Leaving aside the issue of B-61 gravity bombs in Europe, the United States deployed W76-2 following the 2018 nuclear posture review, just to fill the disparity in the deterrence gap with Russia and prevent Russia from carrying out an escalation to de-escalation strategy over the Baltic states. So with that being said, do you think that NATO can play a role in encouraging the non-strategic nuclear weapons talks between the United States and Russia? Or do you think that, or is it something that should be dealt with like unilaterally? And if so, do you think that there's a chance that the Biden administration would retire W76-2 given the sort of threatening features of this warhead from the Russia's perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo. And another participant raised a hand, Alice Saltini. So I asked the technician to give her the floor.
Hi there. Thank you for today's panel discussion. So my question is for Dr. Wan, but I'll be very happy if the other speakers want to jump in and give their own contribution to my question. So basically, Dr. Wan, in your paper, you mentioned the opacity in the nuclear materials safety and security in certain states, underlining the threat of nuclear terrorism in those specific states. For example, you give the example of North Korea, Pakistan, or Iran even. So to enhance this, the safeguarding procedures, well, this should be a national responsibility. You propose the possibility of multilateral collaborations like the CTR, the cooperative threat reduction. I also want to highlight another exceptionally successful initiative, the material protection control and accounting, which was brought about under the auspices of a lab-to-lab cooperation between the US and Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union. So if we were to apply such a model like the one of MPCA or even CTR, in terms of scientific cooperation to states like North Korea, for example, how do you envision the shape of this initiative? Which country would this involve, and would they necessarily be part of NATO, or can you envision other countries to take the leadership for such collaboration? Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia. The next question comes from the chat. I'm going to read it. It's for Wilfred again. Regarding cybersecurity and accidental and unauthorized risk, you have mentioned the possibility to modernize and automate nuclear arsenal because as a nuclear risk reduction. Do you think this should be enough to avoid scenarios like Stuxnet attack in 2012? So this is a question with some familiarity with cyber and other issues, and it's not by accident. It comes from a stagiaire of the AI defense program, Susanna Capretti. The last question of this wave comes from Elisabetta Crevatin, and she asks if an approach based on human security can somehow help the dialogue with China and Russia. And this is a question for whoever wants to pick up. I'm tempted to turn to Leopoldo, but I fear the reply. So let's start with the first question to Rose, second and third to Wilfred, and the fourth on human security for whoever wants to reply.
Well, that's an excellent question. And frankly, I'd like to circle back to a point I made at the outset about how I see the principle that the Trump administration established of a freeze on all nuclear warheads, how important that was, because it superseded what we had been placing a priority on before. That is that we should have a particular limit on non-strategic nuclear warheads, NSNW. And now, as I see it, and again, my recommendation is, although not in government, so I don't know if it will be picked up, but my recommendation is that as we go forward on the new nuclear arms reduction negotiations, we should focus on all nuclear warheads and placing verifiable limits on all nuclear warheads, rather than what I see as a rather artificial distinction between non-strategic warheads and strategic warheads, because the Russians at least use the same warheads on different range of delivery vehicles. So there's no distinction there in many ways. And I do think that for that reason, it's important to focus on trying to limit all nuclear warheads. That said, I do think that NATO can play a role in this, because NATO, European countries do participate in the deployment of some nuclear warheads on European territory, and that is, of course, an issue that will play in upcoming negotiations, even if they are on all nuclear warheads, not just on non-strategic nuclear warheads. So that is also why I believe that it's important for NATO to start thinking now about the complexities of monitoring and verification of sensitive warhead facilities on NATO territory, and what that is going to take in national legal terms, for example, also in terms of cooperation and information sharing. So it's a lot of questions to answer, and I know some work has begun at NATO on these issues already, but I do believe that it will be important. It should be an important priority for NATO to be thinking through what will be possible in partnering among NATO allies on the important issue of how to limit nuclear warheads, and also then how to monitor and verify those limits.
Thank you, Rose. Wilfred, the floor is yours.
Sure. First, thank you to Alice for a question on scientific cooperation. I suppose the answer to that question is it really depends. It's kind of a case-by-case basis as far as where leadership should come from. You mentioned the DPRK. I think logically, I think that would be for China to take some sort of engagement on, and there's some evidence that there has been some scientific engagement at that level. The US and Pakistan, for instance, had some cooperation on nuclear security in the early 2000s. That said, you do have to take into account that there are quite sensitive aspects of this cooperation, because it can be taken to legitimize the nuclear arms status of some of these states that are outside of the NPT. And so this is a case where I think formality of something like the CTR or the example you mentioned, the MPCA, might not quite make a lot of sense. To the question about cyber risk, and certainly I think cyber risk of nuclear weapon systems is something that all nuclear armed states are quite acutely aware of. And I would assume that as part of their modernization, they are indeed improving kind of the defenses and the resilience against potential attacks. The problem, and there has been some research, including from Chatham House on these kind of topics, is that there's a fundamental vulnerability of cyber systems, that it's quite difficult to protect against every eventuality. That whether, there's a question of whether systems can be completely air-gapped or disconnected. And so it's quite difficult to address, every aspect of that risk, especially since the risk doesn't necessarily require direct access to nuclear weapons themselves. That is, access to communication systems, to early warning, et cetera, can actually affect a detonation event. So it is kind of a risk that I think is quite, should be at the top of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilfred. Anyone want to reply to the question, human security and the dialogue with Russia and China?
I can try, but you know what my answer is gonna be, and the answer is I doubt it. I'm frankly very skeptical that the human security approach may have may draw more attention in Beijing and in Moscow than it has in the West. I may be wrong. I don't know if anybody thinks differently. I would be happy to hear someone more optimistic than me.
Well, as one expert told, sometimes it seems that the West lives in a post-Westphalian world, Russia and China in a Westphalian world, and Islamic terrorism in a pre-Westphalian world. So the three time zone or the three world have difficulties also in speaking the same language to each other. Yep. I'm going to the last wave of 5 questions. I know we are close to the end. I kindly ask the speaker to stay 5 minutes more. That is 5:35, and I booked the babysitter for my 2-year-old baby until 6. So this should prevent the explosion of a tactical nuclear weapon in my house before I return. And with this latest comment, I turn to the technician to ask to give the floor to Deborah Capalbo, who raised her hand to tell us a question.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and thanks for accepting me to this very interesting conversation with the speakers. My question could be for Katarzyna Kubiak and also to Leopoldo Nuti, because I was thinking about the NATO role and also the way in which NATO could have an active role in a nuclear disarmament. Mostly because you have mentioned that NATO hasn't have and is not a formal party to any arms control and disarmament treaty. So my question is, do you think that it is time or even hard time that NATO could be a formal party to a nuclear disarmament treaty? And I refer in particular to the NPT. So, and if yes, which could be the consequences and the implications for this assumption? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. Another person raised his hand, Mario Parolari. Please, let's give the floor to Mario for his question.
Hi, good evening. I would like to ask to the speakers to forgive me if they find my question elementary, but I'm kind of new to the topic. So I came up with this question when I read the chapter, the subsection on unauthorized risk in Van's paper, but also in Kubiak's paper, the horizontal non-proliferation, when it comes about nuclear weapons. So my question is, like, how does NATO as a nuclear armed international actor interact in these two scenarios, specifically when it deals with states or with rogue organizations in preventing them to acquire nuclear weapons, whether there is a practical difference in their approach in these two cases, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Third person to give the floor for a live question, a live online question, is Valentina Bacco.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My question is for Wilfred. I know that in your paper you apply a comprehensive approach towards nuclear risk reduction, but I was wondering if you will have this kind of power, which kind of nuclear weapons or which kind of delivery system will you prioritize in a nuclear risk reduction process? I know that previously Rose was a little bit skeptical towards the distinction between strategic and non-strategic nuclear warheads, and I would love to know your take on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina. And we have a last-minute question or last-minute raised hand by Ilenia Santin.
Thank you very much.
Can we give the floor to her?
Good morning. I will be very short. Thanks for the floor. I would like to ask to Mrs. Rose Gottmöller. One of the points highlighted in the paper and as well as today in your presentation is that there is also a need for NATO to support the US efforts to engage with Russia bilaterally. So my question is, how NATO and specifically European partners can help the US in their bilateral approach to Russia in nowadays context, especially after a period of, let's say, difficult transatlantic relationships, which are not that new as a topic. This problem of transatlantic relationship is actually started a long time ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilenia. And there is a question from the chat to Caterina. Do you believe, it's from Nicola Maria Mossone, do you believe that an increased European security strategy and self-sufficiency, and here we may speak about strategic autonomy perhaps, may give more leverage to NATO, or it will go against the goal of the organization in the field we are talking about of arms control and non-proliferation? And the last question of this very rich basket is for Rose, and it can be summarized like this. What about Biden and Kim? What the new US administration approach would be towards North Korea? So let me sum up. We have the Deborah question for Caterina, and well, also for Leopoldo, but we start with Caterina. Caterina, you have also a question on European strategy and self-sufficiency in NATO. Then we turn to Leopoldo with Deborah, and perhaps the Mario question on NATO towards rogue actor. And then we have Wilfred and lots of questions for Rose. So Caterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro. Yeah, so very interesting questions. Maybe I will start with the question from Nicola on European self-sufficiency and security. I feel there are already many ifs in these questions. You know, what do we mean by self-sufficiency? Do we speak conventional self-sufficiency, nuclear self-sufficiency? At the same time, ADN today already is not against NATO goals. And as such, the problem is not if, ADN, but basically how. At the same time, already today, 2 out of 3 NATO nuclear weapon states are European. At the same time, NATO strengths come from a sum both of individual strengths and capabilities and the joint capabilities NATO has. And I would hence risk the question, what is the limit of capabilities and reassurance at which any country will say, or country or organization will say it's enough? And hence, maybe phrasing this question this way may not lead us to an answer on whether, European security strategy and self-sufficiency will lead European NATO states to be more supportive and also active on ADN within the NATO framework. As of the question from Deborah, I understood that you basically ask of what would be the consequences of NATO becoming a former party to a treaty, for example, the NPT. I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding is basically that, it will put legally binding obligations onto NATO and including a necessity to deliver on treaty-related obligations and goals. And in terms of the question from Mario, to be frank, I would need to think about more on how to answer your question. So I'm happy to refer back to you later on.
Thank you, Caterina. Leopoldo?
Yes, on the question by Deborah, yeah, I agree with what Katarina just said, but on top of that, I would also add that since the NPT provides two very different sets of obligations, with Article 1 for the nuclear weapon states and Article 2 for the non-nuclear weapon states, and NATO having countries that are both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, I do not see how NATO could ever become a member to a treaty with two different sets of obligations, because it would create really some sort of legal conundrum that would be impossible to solve, because the obligations would be quite different for the member states.
Thank you, Leopoldo. Wilfred, the floor is yours.
Sure. First, on Mario's question about kind of addressing unauthorized use, the practical difference between NATO and individual states. Well, I think NATO has the ability to kind of pull its resources and its knowledge, right? It engages in these scenario-based exercises and training. And this is especially relevant for states that might not have the individual capacity to do this. And this is kind of the value of these exercises and these guidelines and so forth. To Valentina's question, and it's very nice to see Valentina because she actually was an intern at Unidir a couple of years ago. Which kind of system to get rid of? I'm going to cheat a little bit and not necessarily talk about a specific system, but kind of the types of systems that can cause confusion as to whether or not they are nuclear capable, right? And this can be things like the dual capable cruise missiles, and these kind of systems, especially in tight decision making frameworks. It can drive a miscalculation or misunderstanding, and perhaps some would argue that the W-76 submarine warheads, the low yield warheads, would belong in that category. Thanks.
Thank you, Wilfred. Rose, last word to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for this very rich discussion. It's been excellent today, and we weren't able to cover all the questions, and thank you to Alessandro and the Institute for convening this group of young scholars. It's really been great. So first question from Elenia Santin: how can NATO help the US to engage bilaterally with Russia? I want to stress that there's been a clear message coming out of the Biden administration that they will be clear-eyed with regard to Russia. So I do see a focused engagement with Russia on weapons of mass destruction issues, particularly on the nuclear negotiations, and really emphasizing trying to get those back on track again. But I do think in terms of other issues, and there are many issues about which the United States, and I know other NATO allies, have a grave concern. The jailing of Alexei Navalny is top of the list at the moment, but I would say very close to the top of the list is this extensive cyber attack through the back door of the SolarWinds software system that has really caused a lot of damage in both government organization computer networks, but also for many institutions and corporations. So there are a lot of issues out there that are of grave concern to the United States. And so when the current administration says they're going to be clear-eyed in dealing with Russia, I foresee some pretty direct talks and some pretty firm messages going to Moscow about steps that may be taken to respond to some of these activities. So, in that regard, it's a difficult balancing act, because I always say that weapons of mass destruction pose an existential threat. Nuclear weapons, in particular, pose an existential threat to the United States, to its allies, and to the global community as a whole. And so they must have a special status. We must continue working to control and limit them. But in other areas, I do agree that we need to take a very firm and a very tough role with Russia. And Russia doesn't like that and pushes back, as I know our EU colleagues have seen in just the last week. So there's this balancing act, and it's very, very complex and difficult. But I think to the degree to which the United States and all its NATO allies can be on the same page with regard to Russia. That is probably the most helpful thing to do. On Biden and the DPRK, you know, to be honest, I don't have any glimmer yet of how they are going to address this issue. Again, the Trump administration made some starts with regard to their own outreach, but it's such a cipher, the DPRK, and we just saw in the last day that Kim Jong-un has fired his entire economic team. So, you know, a lot is going on that we don't completely understand about the DPRK, but they just had their big anniversary parade and we saw a lot of weaponry rolling by in that. So here, I think we do need to get back to working very closely with those countries who had been engaged and involved in trying to work with the DPRK. The Chinese, frankly, and I'm going to end on this, Alessandro, because there have been some remarks that the Chinese have never really been engaged. And they've got a completely different attitude for trying to work these issues. But in fact, they've been involved in the six-party talks, put some significant pressure on the DPRK. They also have been really strong partners in the JCPOA, working with Iran to try to constrain and limit their nuclear programs. And furthermore, they are members of some significant international regimes, not only the NPT, but also the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and have abided by the global moratorium on explosive nuclear testing. So I do think, again, I want to end on this, that we have some grounds for working with the Chinese. I'm not going to say they are completely outside, you know, of our approaches on these important issues, and we need to develop that kind of joint work in those particular areas. So again, over back to you, and thank you again for the opportunity of this discussion today.
Thank you, and let me close the virtual event by saying many thanks to the four speakers for their excellent papers and even more for their excellent answers. It was not easy to reply on call like this. Many thanks to Nicola De Santis, Luca Franchetti Pardo, and Natalie Tocci for their welcome, and to the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for their support. Many thanks to Ettore Greco, Federica Dell'Arche, Carolina Muti, and Ottavia Credi for all the work they've done on this project. And well, actually, thank very, very much to the participants for their original, interesting question. It's been indeed a very rich discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you too, and I did so in a nice way. So I hope to see you tomorrow afternoon or morning for the US for the second day of this event. And have a nice continuation of your day or evening. Thank you very much to everyone once again. Best from Rome. See you soon. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.